It has now been 106 days since Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona. More than 3 months have passed without an arrest, without a confirmed suspect, and without answers for the family still waiting to understand what happened that night. But now, the case may be entering a completely different phase, because the newest development is not about a breakthrough in the evidence. It is about who is now communicating with the family. According to recent public comments from Sheriff Chris Nanos, he is no longer directly speaking with the Guthrie family. Those conversations, he says, are now being handled by the FBI. At first, that might not sound dramatic, but in a case already surrounded by frustration, criticism, and unanswered questions, it immediately changes the way many people are looking at this investigation. Because officially, the sheriff's office still leads the case. So if the sheriff remains in charge, why is the FBI now taking over communication with the family? Before we go further, if you follow cases like this because details matter more than headlines, stay with me. Because this case is no longer just about what happened to Nancy Guthrie. It is also becoming a story about confidence in the investigation itself. Sheriff Nanos also publicly acknowledged something many people already suspected. According to his own comments, the public is frustrated. And the Guthrie family is frustrated too. Honestly, that should surprise nobody. Nancy is still missing. No suspect has been publicly identified. And despite the enormous amount of attention surrounding this case, investigators still appear trapped between massive amounts of evidence and very few clear answers. Over the last several months, public discussion surrounding the investigation has continued growing louder. Questions about the handling of evidence, questions about agency coordination, questions about whether critical time may have been lost during the earliest stages of the case. Sheriff Nanos has denied serious tension between his office and the FBI, but public reporting surrounding the investigation has continued suggesting the relationship behind the scenes may be more complicated than officials initially presented. Now, with the FBI reportedly handling direct communication with the family, many people are starting to wonder whether the center of gravity in this case has quietly shifted. That does not automatically mean conflict. It does not automatically mean mistakes are being hidden. But in major investigations, communication matters, especially communication with the victim's family, because it often reflects who is guiding strategy, who controls information, and who the family trusts most during the hardest moments of the investigation. And after 106 days without answers, trust has become one of the biggest issues surrounding this case, because eventually, every unsolved investigation reaches a moment where the public stops asking only what happened. They begin asking something else. Are investigators actually getting closer? And that is where the sheriff's next comments become far more concerning, because while discussing the investigation publicly, he admitted something investigators rarely say this early in an active case. If the forensic evidence reaches a dead end, this case could eventually become a cold case. And suddenly, the DNA evidence may now represent far more than just another lead. It may represent the investigation's best hope. Right now, the DNA evidence appears to sit at the center of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Not because investigators have publicly identified a suspect, not because there has been a confirmed forensic breakthrough, but because recent comments from Sheriff Nanos suggest investigators are still relying heavily on what the labs may eventually uncover. According to the sheriff, investigators reportedly have DNA from an unknown contributor connected to the case. He also suggested they may be getting closer to identifying who that DNA belongs to. For many people following this case, that sounds hopeful. But during the same discussion, the sheriff also acknowledged something much more unsettling. If the labs eventually tell investigators there is nothing more they can do, the case could face the possibility of becoming a cold case. That statement immediately changed the tone surrounding the investigation, because until now, most updates focused on movement, surveillance footage, searches, digital evidence, potential leads. But the phrase cold case forces everyone to confront a different possibility. What if the evidence investigators are waiting on never delivers the breakthrough they need? According to publicly discussed reporting surrounding the case, much of the forensic attention appears connected to a strand of rootless hair investigators have reportedly been analyzing. And because rootless hair is far more difficult to extract usable DNA from, Investigators may be relying on advanced forensic methods, including investigative genetic genealogy. Over the last several years, genetic genealogy has helped solve major criminal cases by identifying distant family connections through DNA databases and slowly narrowing possible identities. But what people often misunderstand is how uncertain and time-consuming that process can become. Even if investigators identify whose DNA it is, that alone does not automatically explain what happened, because DNA raises several critical questions. Whose DNA is it? How did it get there? When was it deposited? And most importantly, is it actually connected to Nancy's disappearance? That is why investigators cannot treat DNA like a magic answer. Context matters just as much as the sample itself, especially in a case where investigators are still trying to reconstruct movement, timing, and behavior. And that may explain why the sheriff's comments about a possible cold case hit so hard publicly, because, for the first time, investigators seem to openly acknowledge something many people feared privately. The investigation may now depend heavily on whether this forensic evidence produces something meaningful. If it does, the case could move dramatically forward. If it does not, investigators may be forced to search for answers somewhere else entirely. And according to experts who have publicly discussed the case, there is one critical thing the public often misunderstands about forensic evidence. DNA alone does not tell investigators what happened. It only tells them someone may have been there. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about modern investigations is believing DNA automatically solves cases. Television helped create that idea. A sample goes into a machine, a suspect appears on a screen, and the mystery is solved within minutes. Real investigations are far more complicated, and in the Nancy Guthrie case, that distinction may become extremely important, because according to experts who have publicly discussed the case, DNA without context can sometimes create as many questions as answers. Former investigator Morgan Wright explained this point clearly during public analysis of the investigation. DNA, he said, does not come with a timestamp. That means even if investigators identify whose DNA was found, the evidence alone cannot explain when it got there, how it got there, or whether it is directly connected to Nancy's disappearance. Human beings constantly leave traces behind without realizing it. Hair, skin cells, fibers, touch DNA. There is a forensic principle known as transfer theory. Whenever people or objects come into contact, tiny pieces of material can move from one surface to another. That means DNA can travel indirectly. A person touches a surface, someone else touches it later. Hair can move through clothing, furniture, vehicles, or airflow inside a room. Most people never think about that. Investigators have to think about it constantly, especially in high-profile cases where enormous pressure exists to turn every piece of evidence into a breakthrough. That is why context matters so much. If investigators can connect DNA directly to the timeline and the offender's actions, it becomes extremely powerful. But if they cannot establish that connection clearly, the evidence becomes much harder to interpret confidently. And according to public discussions surrounding the case, investigators are also facing another massive challenge: surveillance footage. Because according to Sheriff Nanos, law enforcement is now reviewing thousands and thousands of videos from neighborhoods, intersections, businesses, traffic systems, and residential cameras. At first, that sounds like an advantage. In reality, it may be creating an overwhelming amount of information, especially when investigators still do not know exactly who they are looking for. In almost every major investigation today, people assume surveillance footage guarantees answers. There are cameras everywhere now: doorbell cameras, traffic systems, business security footage, entire neighborhoods covered by surveillance. So naturally, many people watching the Nancy Guthrie case keep asking the same question. How can someone appear on camera and still remain unidentified after 106 days? The answer may be simpler and more frustrating than most people realize. Investigators reportedly are not dealing with one important video. They are dealing with thousands. According to Sheriff Nanos, law enforcement has collected enormous amounts of surveillance footage connected to the investigation: traffic cameras, ring cameras, businesses, residential systems, intersections across Tucson and surrounding areas. At first, that sounds promising, until you realize investigators are reviewing those videos without already knowing who the suspect is. That changes everything. Every passing vehicle becomes potentially important. Every pair of headlights becomes another possibility. And according to public comments from the sheriff, investigators have reportedly been organizing vehicles into categories: white trucks, red sedans, and other movement patterns that may eventually help narrow the timeline. But surveillance only becomes truly powerful once investigators know what they are trying to isolate. Without that anchor point, too much footage can actually slow an investigation down. And that may explain why this case still appears trapped between two realities. At the same time, there is an enormous amount of evidence, and yet there is still no publicly identified suspect. That frustration has led some analysts to focus on one theory that may completely change the way the footage should be viewed: the vehicle theory. Because according to public analysis from former investigator Morgan Wright, the removed camera may never have been about hiding the offender's face. It may have been about hiding what was outside the frame, the vehicle. And if that theory is correct, then the most important clue in this entire case may not be the figure standing near Nancy Guthrie's home. It may be whatever carried someone away from it. At first, the vehicle theory sounds almost too simple. But the deeper investigators looked at the reported evidence, the more important that possibility started to become. Because according to the publicly discussed surveillance footage, the person outside Nancy Guthrie's home already appeared heavily concealed. Face covered, gloves, layers of clothing, very little visible skin. So that raises a major question. If the offender was already hiding their identity so carefully, why spend additional time interfering with the camera itself? Why take the extra risk? According to the theory discussed publicly by former investigator Morgan Wright, the answer may be that the camera itself was never the real problem. What the camera could capture was the problem, the vehicle. And the logic behind that idea is difficult to ignore. A masked face is hard to identify, but vehicles create patterns investigators can track. Traffic cameras, intersections, parking lots, gas stations, license plate readers, city surveillance systems. Even small details can become important over time. That means the biggest danger for an offender may not have been exposing their face. It may have been exposing transportation. Another detail discussed publicly makes this theory even more significant. According to analysis surrounding the case, blood evidence reportedly appeared to stop near the curb area outside the home. Some experts reviewing the scene suggested that location could potentially indicate where a vehicle may have been positioned. Not proof, not confirmation, but enough to raise serious investigative questions. Because if Nancy was moved into a vehicle at that point, then suddenly the camera angle becomes extremely important. Removing or blocking the camera would make strategic sense, not because the offender feared facial recognition, but because they feared movement reconstruction. And that changes the focus of the entire investigation. Instead of asking only who was outside the house, investigators may also need to ask, where did the vehicle go? How quickly did it leave? Was transportation planned ahead of time? And according to several analysts who have publicly discussed the case, the reported behavior appears more controlled than impulsive. The concealment, the camera interference, the possible positioning of a vehicle, none of that identifies a suspect, but behavior can still reveal planning. And if transportation was prepared beforehand, then the most important part of this investigation may no longer be the inside of Nancy Guthrie's home. It may be the route out. If the vehicle theory is correct, then the real crime scene may not end at Nancy Guthrie's front door. It may stretch across roads, intersections, highways, and an entire timeline investigators are still trying to reconstruct. Because once a vehicle enters an abduction case, everything changes. The investigation stops being tied to one location. Now investigators have to focus on movement, direction, timing, distance. According to public discussions surrounding the case, investigators may now be trying to reconstruct exactly how someone could have left the area after Nancy disappeared. Some analysts believe this case may ultimately depend on reverse investigative strategy. Instead of waiting for a suspect to appear first, investigators may need to identify unusual vehicle movement patterns and work backward from there. That process is extremely difficult, but it can transform chaos into structure. Investigators can narrow vehicles by time window, direction of travel, repeated appearances on nearby cameras, and unusual movement patterns after the incident. And geography matters too. Southern Arizona creates investigative challenges many people outside the region may not fully understand. Long roads, rural areas, multiple exit routes. Large distances where vehicles can disappear quickly once they leave concentrated camera coverage. That does not mean investigators have confirmed anyone crossed borders or left the state. There is no public evidence proving that. But experienced investigators still have to consider every realistic possibility. And despite all the surveillance footage, all the forensic testing, and all the public attention surrounding this case, investigators still face one deeply frustrating reality. No one has publicly identified the suspect. No decisive witness has emerged. No reward tip has publicly solved the case, which raises another difficult question. How can someone appear on camera in one of the country's most discussed investigations and still remain unknown after 106 days? One of the most disturbing parts of the Nancy Guthrie case is not simply the footage itself. It is the silence surrounding it. Because in many major investigations, once surveillance images become public, investigators usually expect something eventually breaks through. A coworker recognizes a walk, a neighbor notices clothing, a friend suddenly connects suspicious behavior to the footage. Sometimes it only takes one person, one phone call, one moment of recognition. And yet, more than 106 days into this investigation, no public breakthrough like that has happened. That fact alone has fueled enormous speculation online, but experienced investigators often view silence differently. Sometimes silence becomes evidence itself. One possible explanation is that the suspect may not be local to the immediate area. If that is true, recognition becomes dramatically harder. Another possibility is that investigators may be dealing with a lone offender, because the more people involved in a crime, the harder secrecy becomes. More people create more chances for fear, conflict, mistakes, or betrayal. But one person acting alone can remain silent far more effectively. Several analysts who have publicly discussed the case believe some of the reported behavior appears controlled rather than chaotic. The concealment, the camera interference, the possible transportation planning. Again, none of that proves identity. But behavior can still suggest preparation. And if the offender planned carefully enough, that could explain why the reward money has not produced the breakthrough many expected. There is also another reality many viewers underestimate. Human beings are not nearly as good at identification as they believe they are, especially under poor lighting, especially when faces are partially concealed, especially when clothing changes body shape and movement. People online often say, "Someone has to recognize him." But investigators know recognition is rarely that simple. And over time, that frustration has slowly shifted toward another question entirely, not just who committed the crime, but whether the investigation itself has handled the case effectively enough to solve it. As the Nancy Guthrie case moves deeper past the 100-day mark, public frustration has slowly expanded beyond the mystery itself. It has started focusing on the investigation. Questions about communication between agencies, questions about early decisions, questions about whether critical time may have been lost. Sheriff Chris Nanos has publicly denied serious tension between his office and the FBI. He insists federal authorities were involved from the beginning. But public reporting surrounding the case has continued suggesting the relationship behind the scenes may have been more complicated. And whether those reports are fully accurate or not, perception now matters almost as much as evidence. Because after 106 days without answers, public confidence has clearly become part of the story itself. That is why the sheriff's comments about no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family drew so much attention. Whether intentional or not, it reinforced the growing belief that the FBI may now be playing a much larger operational role than many originally thought. But there is another side to this conversation that also deserves honesty. Major investigations are incredibly difficult. Television creates unrealistic expectations. On TV, evidence appears instantly. DNA solves crimes overnight. Surveillance footage becomes perfectly clear with one computer click. Real investigations are far messier. Investigators deal with incomplete timelines, uncertain evidence, conflicting information, and enormous pressure from the public, media, and families waiting for answers. That does not mean criticism is unfair. Some criticism may absolutely be justified. Early decisions matter enormously in cases involving disappearances and possible abductions, but frustration alone is not proof of failure. And underneath all the debates about agency, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence, one reality remains unchanged. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. That is the fact sitting underneath every headline and every theory. A family still wakes up every day without answers. And perhaps that is the real lesson of this case. Sometimes the truth is not hidden behind one missing clue. Sometimes it is buried inside thousands of small details investigators are still trying to connect together. The unknown DNA, the removed camera, the possible vehicle, the unanswered route out of the neighborhood. Individually, each detail feels incomplete. Together, they may eventually tell the full story of what happened that night. But until investigators can connect those pieces clearly, this case will continue haunting people for one simple reason. It still feels like the truth may be only one breakthrough away. If you discuss this case, do it responsibly. Focus on evidence, timelines, and verified information rather than rumors or accusations. Because in cases like this, public attention matters, but disciplined attention matters even more.